Those who find their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it in the name of the living God who is creating, redeeming, and sustaining us. Amen. Well, good morning. Good morning. You know, when I was a young man growing up out in West Texas, I always wanted to be a cowboy. My father had been a cowboy and rode a horse to school every morning. And every year, my father would take my brothers and me to the rodeo, and I loved it. I loved the clowns and the barrel racers and the calf roping. But the event that really caught my eye, the event that really fascinated me, was the bull riding. And I couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old one year as the bull riding competition began, and I looked at my father and said, "Dad, do you know who I'd like to meet? I'd like to meet the first man who decided it would be a good idea to crawl on top of an angry bull and ride it." Well, my father thought about this for a minute, and he said, "Yes, son, it would be interesting to meet that first man who rode a bull, but the guy I want to meet is the second idiot who thought that would be a good idea." My father was a wise man, and he had a point. The more you understand the risks of what you're doing, the higher the level of commitment that is required of you. I'll say that again. The more you understand the risk of what you're doing, the higher the level of commitment is required of you. And I think that story is related to our gospel this morning. So what are we to do with this challenging passage? How are we to reconcile this Jesus, who, quite frankly, seems a little cranky, with the Prince of Peace, who told his disciples to put away their sword, because to live that way meant you would die that way? I think Jesus is talking to his disciples, trying to explain the risks of following him. I'm almost certain that Matthew was trying to help his community understand the risks of the Christian way of life. Now, we think, scholars tell us, that Matthew's gospel was written somewhere between 85 AD and 130, possibly in Antioch or someplace in Syria. If that's so, it puts Matthew's gospel and Matthew's community squarely within the onset of the Christian persecution. We happen to know a good deal about these persecutions, in part due to the diary of a young woman named Perpetua. Now, Perpetua was martyred in 203, so within 30 years or so of the time of Matthew's gospel. I suspect Matthew's community was intimately familiar with stories like hers, and hers is a story about the risk of following Jesus. Perpetua was the daughter of a very famous, prosperous family in Carthage, and the mother of an infant son. She and 4 of her friends were all catechumens. They were candidates for baptism. Unfortunately, the Roman emperor had forbidden conversion to Christianity or Judaism. So Perpetua and her friends were arrested and imprisoned. At that time, Christians were essentially treated as traitors, which meant not only that you would suffer the death penalty, but also that your family's wealth and property were subject to forfeiture. Perpetua's father became one of her tormentors. He came to visit her in jail and begged her to denounce her faith. When she refused, he flew into a rage and beat her. He returned again to visit her. "Have pity on your father," he said, "if I am worthy to be called your father. Don't make me a subject of scorn. Think about your son, too. He can't live without you." At her trial, when she refused to renounce her Christianity, the procurator ordered that she be beaten with rods, and her father carried out that sentence against her himself. But on the birthday of the emperor's son, she was thrown into the arena with wild beasts. Because the brutal attack did not quite kill her, ultimately a young gladiator killed her with a sword. So when Matthew wrote in his gospel about the gospel tearing families apart, I think he was describing the experience of his own community. I think their experience of the resurrected Christ taught them about the risk of following Jesus and taught them that death was not something they had to fear. For those who believe in Jesus, who follow Jesus, there are things far worse that can happen to us than dying. By the way, Perpetua's diary was read aloud in churches, in those secret churches in the empire for many years. But I want to contrast her story with the story of another man, a man named Jacob Wendell. He was only 19 when he fell in with a bad crowd, a crowd of wicked and cruel and sinful men. Now, he may not have actually done any killing, but he stood guard while these men engaged in torture and murder. And when he was brought to trial, he argued he didn't have any choice. If he hadn't done it, they would have killed him. Oh, I forgot to mention that Jacob was a guard in the tower at Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp. And from that tower, he would have seen the smoke of the crematoria and seen the trucks pull in with tanks of Zyklon B gas. And I'm in no position to judge him, because the Lord knows that the worst mistakes I've ever made in my life, I made because I was afraid. And Jacob was able to save his life by being a guard at that camp. But in another much broader sense, he lost his life. I think for those of us who follow Jesus, there are far worse things that can happen to us than dying. I'm much more afraid of being a callous human being, or turning away from suffering, or living in a world where cruelty is the norm, than I am of dying. The Christian life is not easy, and every day we have to make a choice, and that choice involves a risk. It involves a struggle. We may not all be called to be martyrs, but we are all called to struggle with the question of who we are going to follow. Every day, I struggle with that question. There are parts of me that want to follow Jesus, and there are other parts of me that want to follow James. The parts that want to follow James come much easier. They allow me to loose that sharp tongue I inherited from my mother. They allow me to decide who is worthy of love and who is not. And sometimes those parts of me go to the Almighty, the one who created the universe, and suggest how he might improve the way things are going down here. Following James doesn't require nearly as much effort as following Jesus. which asks me to practice forgiveness and grace and compassion, all of these challenge us. All of these ask us to take a risk. There is nothing easy about this Christianity thing. You know, when we baptize a baby, we give that family a candle. And when we confirm someone in those baptismal promises, we give them a Bible. And those are fine gifts. But sometimes I think if we really wanted to prepare people for the Christian life, we would give them seat belts and a crash helmet. Because this walk of faith we are taking with Jesus, it can be a bumpy road. But we don't have to be afraid. Just like God told Hagar in the wilderness, just like Jesus told his disciples in today's gospel, just like he's telling you and me, we don't have to be afraid. The God who knows even the ever-dwindling number of hairs on my head will not leave us. No matter how dark the times, no matter how difficult the road, no matter how painful the situation, we will never wander so far that we escape God's notice or love. Never. So we don't have to be afraid. We really don't. Amen.